Right now, somewhere in your city, a man is on his third date this week. A woman is choosing between two people she met online. Somewhere else, a couple is celebrating their 40th anniversary. And a therapist is listening to someone describe the slow collapse of a marriage they thought would last forever. We treat these as personal stories, individual failures or successes. But they are not. They are the echo of something decided long before you were born. The question of how many partners a man should have has been argued in churches, courtrooms, and comment sections for centuries. But the argument was always happening in the wrong room. The real answer lives somewhere else entirely, in the bones of your ancestors, in the math of survival, in a pattern so old it predates language, fire-making, and the wheel. And when you see the actual numbers, the picture that emerges is nothing like what either side of the modern debate wants you to believe. For over 300,000 years, your ancestors did not date. They did not marry in the way you understand marriage. There were no weddings, no vows, no legal contracts binding two people together in the eyes of a state that didn't exist yet. What they had was something messier, something more honest. They had proximity, they had negotiation, they had group dynamics that made modern relationship drama look simple by comparison. And inside all of that complexity, the question of how many women one man partnered with across his lifetime was not answered by preference or personality or charm. It was answered by resources, status, biology, and the ruthless logic of who survived long enough to matter. The numbers that come out of that logic will surprise you. Because the story you've been told, whether you heard it from evolutionary psychology podcasts, or from religious tradition, or from somewhere in between, is almost certainly incomplete. In 2003, anthropologist Joseph Henrich, along with Robert Boyd and Robert Trivers, published research examining mating systems across 849 human societies, cataloged by ethnographers over 2 centuries of fieldwork. What they found was stark. About 85% of those societies permitted polygyny. One man, multiple wives, culturally sanctioned, legally recognized within those societies. Normalized. Only about 15% of societies were strictly monogamous by cultural rule. 85%. Most people stop reading there. They take that number and run with it. They use it to argue that men are naturally polygynous. That monogamy is artificial. That human males were designed by evolution to spread as widely as possible. But permitted is not the same as practiced. In those polygynous societies, the majority of men still ended up with one woman. Or none. Polygyny in practice was a privilege of the powerful. A chieftain with 4 wives pulled the average up, while the man with no land, no cattle, and no status had nothing. The data looks like abundance when you read the headline. It looks like brutal inequality when you read the fine print. That gap between what was allowed and what was actually happening is where the real story lives. Picture a camp of early Homo sapiens in the Rift Valley of East Africa. Around 150 people, maybe 35 adult men of reproductive age, maybe 38 adult women. Resources are not equally distributed, neither is status, neither is luck. The man who is the best tracker gets first access to meat. Meat is power. Meat is calories. Meat is the thing a woman with a nursing infant desperately needs, and the thing a woman choosing a partner is quietly, constantly evaluating. Anthropologist Frank Marlowe spent years living with the Hadza of Tanzania, one of the last intact hunter-gatherer societies on Earth. He documented their mating patterns with the kind of granular detail that only comes from being physically present across seasons, not just visiting for a week with a notebook. What he found was that most Hadza men across their entire lifetimes partnered with between 1 and 3 women, not simultaneously, sequentially, one at a time across years and decades, with relationships ending through death, separation, or the slow drift that happens when camps split and people move on. The rare Hadza man with 2 wives at once was typically older, better at hunting, and more respected within the group. Not richer in the modern sense, richer in the ancient sense. More useful, more trusted, more embedded in the social fabric of the camp in ways that made him a safer bet across a hard, unpredictable year. That is a crucial distinction, Because what that means is that ancient partnership was not primarily a romantic transaction. It was a resource calculation. And not just for the men. For the women making the choices, the stakes were existential in a way modern life makes almost impossible to feel. Anthropologist Sarah Blaffer Hrdy, in her landmark 2009 book Mothers and Others, laid out the arithmetic of ancient survival with a clarity that reshapes everything. A hunter-gatherer woman raising children in a band needed roughly twice the calories she could gather alone. Her children needed protection, teaching, and supplemental food for years after weaning. The group, the extended kin network, the allow mothers and cooperative breeders around her, were not optional extras. They were the infrastructure that made reproduction viable at all, which means the man a woman partnered with was not just a romantic companion. He was a node in a survival network. His value was measured not just in what he provided directly to her, but in how reliably he showed up for the larger group that her children depended on. A man who disappeared, who hoarded, who could not be trusted to share meat or defend the camp or teach the children, was not just a bad partner. He was a liability. He reduced her children's chances of surviving to adulthood. That kind of selection pressure, running across hundreds of thousands of years, shaped the male body and the male psychology in ways that are still visible in you right now. Here is what that looked like in practice, at the level of daily life. A man in an ancient hunter-gatherer camp woke up in a world where everyone knew everything about him. His hunting record was public knowledge. His temperament was public. His ability to share, to defend, to contribute, to remain calm under stress, all of it visible to every woman in that group and to every other man competing for the same limited pool of partners. There was no privacy. There was no performance you could sustain indefinitely. You could not fake being a good provider when the entire camp watched you come back empty-handed for the third week in a row. Richard Lee, the anthropologist who spent decades studying the Yankung sand of the Kalahari Desert, documented something remarkable about this visibility. Men who hoarded resources or overinflated their status were publicly mocked. The Akung practiced what Lee called insulting the meat. When a successful hunter brought back a large kill, other camp members would deliberately downplay it. Call it scrawny, barely worth butchering, hardly enough to bother with. This was not cruelty and it was not jealousy. It was social technology, a mechanism for keeping any one man from accumulating enough status to dominate the group unchecked. That same practice has been documented among the Hadza by Marlowe, among the Ek of Paraguay by anthropologist Kim Hill, and among dozens of other forager societies. It appears so consistently that researchers now recognize it as a near-universal feature of mobile hunter-gatherer life, which means the ancient man with multiple partners had to be genuinely exceptional, not performing exceptionalism. Actually exceptional. Across years, not just seasons, the group made sure of it, deliberately, collectively, and relentlessly. But here is where the evolutionary story gets strange, and uncomfortable in a different way than you might expect. The question of how many women a man partnered with cannot be separated from a darker question underneath it. How many men got to partner at all? When geneticists began mapping the ratio of male to female ancestors in the deep human past, using patterns in mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome lineages, they found something that reframes the entire conversation. For most of human prehistory, roughly twice as many women reproduced as men. Let that settle for a moment. Twice as many women left genetic descendants as men. Across hundreds of thousands of years, a significant portion of men lived and died without children. They competed, they hunted, they defended the camp, and they vanished from the genetic record without a trace. A 2015 study led by researcher Monica Carmen and published in Genome Research analyzed Y chromosome diversity across 69 global populations and found a dramatic bottleneck in male lineages occurring roughly 5,000 to 7,000 years ago. The number of distinct male lineages reproducing successfully collapsed to a fraction of what it had been. Some researchers estimate the ratio reached as extreme as one man reproducing for every 17 women during certain periods of the Neolithic transition. One man. 17 women. Not because men were dying at unusually high rates, though some were, but because a small number of dominant males were monopolizing reproduction across large populations. A few men at the top. Hundreds of thousands of men producing nothing but their own death. That world did not emerge from nowhere. It was built on a transition that changed the rules of human society more completely than anything before or since. Roughly 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, humans in multiple regions of the world independently began to farm. They domesticated plants, they domesticated animals, they stopped following the food and started making the food come to them. And for the first time in human history, it was possible to accumulate more than you could carry. Land, grain, livestock, wealth that didn't spoil, wealth that could be passed down. Wealth that, once concentrated, could buy loyalty, protection, and access to women in ways that no hunter-gatherer band had ever permitted. The Mark Stone King team's ancient DNA research, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, found that shift in male genetic diversity coinciding almost exactly with the rise of agriculture and the social hierarchies that followed it. The math is stark. Before farming, the bottleneck was not nearly as severe. After farming, in the populations that transitioned to settled life, male reproductive inequality exploded. Agriculture did not just change what people ate, it changed who got to pass their genes forward. And the man who had been merely exceptional in the ancient camp, the best tracker, the most reliable sharer, now found himself competing against men who owned the water, the land, and the armies. Exceptionalism stopped being enough. To understand how radical this shift was, you have to feel the contrast at the level of daily experience. In a mobile forager band, an ambitious man had one real lever: his reputation within a group of 150 people who had known him since birth. He could not outrun his past. He could not buy a fresh start. He could not inherit wealth because there was no wealth to inherit. Every season more or less reset the board. Polly Wiesner, an anthropologist who has spent decades studying the Ju-Hwansi-san of southern Africa, documented the elaborate gift-giving networks called Axaro that connected bands across hundreds of miles. These networks were social insurance. A man who gave generously built bonds that would feed his children during a drought 3 years later. A man who hoarded built nothing. Weissner found that these networks were one of the primary drivers of both social cohesion and mating access. The most connected men, not always the strongest or the fastest, but the most generous and most trusted, had the widest social reach, and that social reach translated directly into reproductive opportunity. That is how the ancient system worked. That is what it selected for across hundreds of thousands of years, in your ancestors, which means in you. And then the system changed. In ancient Rome, a wealthy man could have a wife, concubines, and enslaved partners simultaneously and faced no social penalty. In Han Dynasty China, emperors maintained harems numbering in the thousands. In the Aztec Empire, the Tlatoani, the supreme ruler, kept hundreds of women in his palace while ordinary men had one wife or none. The common thread across these societies is not culture. It is not religion. It is accumulated, heritable wealth used to purchase reproductive access at a scale that forager societies had made structurally impossible. What the ancient camp prevented with social ridicule and meat insulting and collective leveling, the agricultural state enabled with property law and military force. We invented pair bonding contracts. We eliminated the open negotiation of the ancient camp. We traded a messy, visible, socially regulated system for a private one governed by law, vow, and the property rights of men over women. The Catholic Church's push for strict monogamy beginning in late antiquity was not purely theological. It was partly structural. Concentrating inheritance within one legitimate family line created social stability. It reduced the endless warfare of elite polygynous competition. It channeled male ambition in directions that the Church and then the state could manage. Monogamy, in this light, was not a return to nature. It was a political technology, a solution to a problem that agriculture had created. We traded something in that exchange. And the trade is still running inside you. Here is the part that pulls it all together. The average ancient man, the one who was not a chief, not a warrior king, not an emperor, the man who made up the overwhelming majority of human history, that man partnered with somewhere between 1 and 3 women across his entire lifetime, sequentially, in a social system that watched him constantly and held him accountable in ways modern men will never experience. He was not free. He was not swimming in abundance. He was navigating a social world of extraordinary complexity where his reproductive future depended on being genuinely useful to people who had no obligation to pretend he was. That man's body is your body. His nervous system is your nervous system. The anxiety that spikes when you feel low status. The hunger for recognition. The way your brain lights up differently when you feel chosen versus overlooked. The pull toward generosity when you feel secure, and toward hoarding when you feel threatened. These are not personality quirks or character flaws. They are the residue of a selection process that ran for 300,000 years without pause. And then, in the last 10,000 years, the environment changed faster than the wiring could follow. The Hadza man napping in the shade of an acacia tree, knowing his hunting record is being quietly assessed by everyone around him, is not a relic. He is the template, the baseline from which everything else is a deviation. His world had no anonymity, no escape from reputation, no way to be one person in public and another in private, because there was no private. His character was his biography, and his biography was visible. Your world has given you something his never could. The freedom to be unknown, the freedom to start over, the freedom to build a life far from the people who knew you before you became who you are. But your body does not know that. Your body still expects the camp. It still tracks status as if 150 people are watching. It still responds to rejection as if it means exclusion from the group that keeps you alive. It still measures generosity against an ancient ledger that no one is keeping anymore. The average ancient man did not have many women. He had one, maybe two, across a lifetime of visible, accountable, socially embedded effort in a world where everyone knew his name and watched what he did with it. The man with many women was the exception, and the exception was rarer than the story lets on. What is not rare, what is in fact universal, is the want. The ancient wanting that your body carries forward into a world it was not built for, still scanning the camp, still counting the eyes on you, still trying to be enough for a group that no longer exists in the form your nervous system is looking for, that thread runs from the Rift Valley to right now. And the remarkable thing is not how different you are from that man in the acacia shade. It is how little, underneath everything, you have changed at all. If you made it this far, you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. We make videos like this one every week, about ancient human behavior, about what your body still remembers, about the gap between the world you were built for and the one you actually live in. If that is something you want more of, hit subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it tells the algorithm that this kind of storytelling is worth keeping alive. See you in the next one.